What most audiences are seeing about the protests in Iran is not reality itself, but reality filtered through a dense and highly distorted media environment. Depending on where you look, the country appears to be on the verge of immediate collapse. Stories circulate claiming the supreme leader is preparing an escape route to Moscow, that ethnic insurgents are seizing control of entire towns, or that senior military commanders are abandoning the state en masse. Taken together, these narratives create a powerful impression that Iran is only days away from disintegration. But when these claims are examined carefully, most of them do not hold up. What they represent instead is a mixture of exaggeration, selective reporting, and strategic disinformation layered on top of very real social unrest. Rather than obsessing over dramatic headlines or viral clips, it is far more useful to examine the structural pressures surrounding these protests, because those pressures define what the unrest can realistically achieve and where its limits lie. This distinction matters, because the way events are framed internationally is not neutral. External actors, particularly the United States, have strong incentives to portray the protests as existential. Such framing helps create political justification for harsher policies and, potentially, for renewed efforts at regime change. None of this negates the reality that Iranians are protesting, nor does it diminish the human cost of the crackdown. Many people have lost their lives, and countless others are risking imprisonment, injury, or worse by taking to the streets. Their grievances are real, and their courage deserves empathy rather than dismissal. At the same time, information coming out of Iran is extraordinarily difficult to verify. The state has imposed severe restrictions on internet access and communications, creating an environment where reliable reporting is scarce. In that vacuum, rumors travel faster than facts. Opposition networks amplify worst-case scenarios, state media downplays unrest, and foreign outlets often fill the gaps with speculation. What this suggests is not that nothing is happening, but that nearly everything we see must be treated with caution. Iran's internal problems are deep and long-standing. Corruption is entrenched, repression is systematic, and religious authority is enforced in ways that shape daily life down to the most personal decisions. These conditions have produced cycles of protest for years. Yet the current unrest cannot be understood in isolation from the broader pressures bearing down on the country. Iran is confronting several overlapping crises at the same time, and it is their convergence that explains both the scale of the demonstrations and the limits of their potential impact. One of these pressures is environmental. Iran is facing a severe water crisis that has been building for decades. Aquifers are depleted, rivers are polluted or drying up, and lakes that once supported entire regions are disappearing. Water scarcity has forced internal migration, hollowed out rural economies, and intensified competition between provinces. These stresses rarely make headlines, but they quietly destabilize societies by eroding livelihoods and social cohesion. Another pressure is energy. Years of sanctions, mismanagement, and aging infrastructure have left Iran struggling to meet its own natural gas needs. Every winter, shortages translate into price spikes and public anger. This problem has been magnified by recent conflict. Following strikes on energy infrastructure during the 2025 confrontation involving Israel and the United States, Iran has been unable to restore capacity quickly. The result has been higher costs across the economy at a time when households are already stretched to their limits. The third and perhaps most visible pressure is economic. Since the collapse of the 2015 nuclear agreement and the reimposition of sweeping sanctions, Iran's economy has been locked in a downward spiral. Inflation has eaten away at savings, wages lag behind prices, and the national currency has suffered dramatic depreciation. These conditions are not new, but they have intensified sharply in recent months. When a currency loses a significant portion of its value in a short period of time, it acts as a psychological breaking point. People who were previously coping suddenly realize that waiting things out is no longer an option. This helps explain why the latest protests began in commercial centers rather than university campuses or peripheral regions. When shopkeepers and traders take to the streets, it signals that economic pain has reached the heart of daily life. From there, demonstrations spread outward, drawing in students, workers, and transport sectors. What we are witnessing is not a sudden awakening, but the release of pressure that has been accumulating for years. Iran's leadership is acutely aware of these dynamics. The current president was elected on promises of economic relief through renewed negotiations with the West. Those efforts failed. Talks stalled, positions hardened, and then military strikes further poisoned the diplomatic environment. Faced with shrinking options, the political elite turned inward. Ministers were dismissed, officials reshuffled, and symbolic changes were made to signal responsiveness. But none of these moves addressed the structural problems facing ordinary Iranians. They were gestures rather than solutions. This leads to a critical point that is often misunderstood. Regardless of how large the protests become, the Iranian state is not inclined to surrender power voluntarily. It has survived war, sanctions, and decades of isolation. It retains loyal institutions, financial networks, and a core support base that should not be underestimated. Millions of people continue to back the system, whether out of ideological conviction, material dependence, or fear of what might replace it. That support underpins the security forces and gives the state resilience even in moments of severe unrest. It is also misleading to treat Iran's government as a single, unified actor. Internal rivalries and disagreements are real. Protests can shift the balance between factions, empowering some while weakening others. In that sense, unrest may catalyze change from within rather than produce immediate collapse. That change could take multiple directions. It might strengthen pragmatic voices seeking limited reform, or it could push power further into the hands of hardline security institutions. One scenario that continues to circulate is the idea of mass defections within Iran's armed forces. Here, nuance matters. The country maintains both a regular military and a powerful parallel force in the form of the Revolutionary Guards. The latter is deeply integrated into the political and economic system. Its leadership has little incentive to abandon the status quo. If cracks appear, they are more likely to emerge in the conventional army, which has historically been less privileged and less ideologically tied to the ruling clergy. Even so, isolated defections do not equate to institutional collapse. Another factor shaping perceptions is the fragmented nature of Iran's opposition. Inside the country, organized political opposition has been systematically neutralized or absorbed. Outside, exile groups are divided along ideological lines that make coordination difficult. Monarchists, leftists, Republicans, and others share opposition to the current system but little else. Online, some of these factions have been effective at amplifying dramatic narratives. On the ground, their influence is far more limited. Many Iranians who oppose the government are also deeply wary of what might follow its collapse. The memory of regional chaos looms large. There is a widespread fear that a sudden breakdown of central authority could trigger fragmentation along ethnic or regional lines. For some, the current system, however coercive, is seen as a guarantor of territorial integrity. This tension helps explain why protest movements struggle to transform anger into a unified political alternative. All of this leads to a sobering conclusion. Iran is experiencing one of its most serious waves of unrest in decades, but expectations of rapid regime collapse are misplaced. The state retains the capacity to suppress demonstrations, at least in the near term. At the same time, prolonged unrest exposes Iran's leadership to external pressure and internal erosion. The longer the crisis drags on, the narrower the path forward becomes. What this suggests is not a clean resolution, but a grinding contest with no good outcomes. For the government, repression deepens legitimacy problems. For protesters, escalation carries enormous risks with uncertain rewards. For the region, instability in Iran raises stakes that extend far beyond its borders. The future, in this context, is less about dramatic tipping points and more about slow-moving consequences that will shape Iran's trajectory for years to come. And that leaves us with an open question. If neither collapse nor reform offers a clear way out, what path remains for a society caught between internal pressure and external confrontation? That is the question Iranians are grappling with now, and it is one that deserves careful thought rather than simplistic answers.